I have been doing an overall survey, an expository survey of the Old Testament. We are now in the book of Esther. And as we look at Esther, the introduction to the book, we begin with the title. The book gets its name from its main character, Esther. This is a Persian name and means star. Her Hebrew name, Hadassah, meaning myrtle, was no doubt changed to the Persian name. The Jews called the book Megillot Esther, or the Esther scroll, and it is read at the Feast of Purim. As to the author, various views of authorship have been suggested. Jewish tradition places the men of the great synagogue as the writers of the book of Esther. Josephus attributes it to Mordecai. This is given strength by the fact that in the last two chapters of Esther, there is mention, letters or writings of Mordecai. While this may sound encouraging, there is no evidence that these writings composed any part of the book of Esther. This view is unlikely by the reference to Mordecai in 10:3. Actually, it is impossible to determine with certainty the identity of the author. The writer does show an intimate knowledge of the events of Xerxes' reign and of the furnishing of the Shushan palace. Persian words appear in the book, and the Hebrew style resembles closely that of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles. The author then must have been a Jew living in Persia around the latter half of the 5th century, who had access to the writings of Mordecai and the official chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. We see this from 2:23 and 9:20 and 10:2. With these sources, along with oral tradition, as a contemporary then of the events narrated, the author wrote the roll or the scroll of Esther. The date of writing was no doubt after the reign of Xerxes, which was 486 to 465 BC. Since his reign is spoken of in the past tense in chapter 10, verse 2. Some seek to date it then after the reign of Artaxerxes the first, who actually reigned from 464 to 425 BC. But the author shows too close a familiarity with the events of Xerxes' reign and his surroundings to do this. Since the author had access to the official chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia, and we see this in 2:23, 9:20, and 10:2, and since its Hebrew style is similar in a close way to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, it seems best to date its writing during the reign of Artaxerxes I. Merrill F. Unger concludes this when he writes, "Those who accept the historicity of the book place it sometime during or near the reign of Artaxerxes Longimanus, 464 to 425 BC, which accounts also for its literary phenomena, since its diction is comparable to such late books, again, as Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles." In terms of its historical background, following the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus in 539 BC, some of the Jewish people moved eastward to Shushan and other cities in Media Persia. We reference this in Esther 2, 5, and 6. About 50,000 Jewish people chose to return to Palestine in 536 BC. Again, we see this in Ezra 2, 64 through 67, and help in the completion of the Second Temple, seen again in Ezra 6:15. 32 years later, Xerxes, the son of Darius the first, made a feast unto all the princes and his servants. Esther chapter 1. The book of Esther portrays then the period beginning with this feast, and we could date that around 483 BC, until the institution of the Feast of Purim in 473 BC. Just 10 years are then recovered, can we say, by the book. Following the Feast of Purim, 16 years later, Ezra goes to Jerusalem and sees the revival that we saw in Ezra chapter 7 and 8 and following. The background, therefore, for the book of Esther falls between Ezra 6 and 7, I believe. The purpose of the book is to show the providence of God in caring for his dispersed people, as well as to set forth the origin of the Feast of Purim. This is tersely then summarized again by Young. The book of Esther serves the purpose of showing how divine providence overrules all things. Even in a distant, far country, God's people are yet in his hands. But since they are in this distant, far country and not in the land of promise, his name is not mentioned. The argument, and yet many have said, even though we don't have the name of God, by the way, we see the finger of God in his providential dealings all the way through the book of Esther. In terms of its main contents, the theme of the book of Esther is God's providence and his care. The post-exilic Jews in Persia are in great danger and are heroically delivered by Esther the queen. The grave danger of the Jews is first set down in chapter 1:1 through 4:17, followed then by the great deliverance that God used of Esther in 5:1 through 10, verse 3. Ahasuerus, the king, in the midst of the feast, orders his queen to display her beauty before the assembled people. She refuses, and the king, after consulting with his wise men, deposes her. Plans then are made to replace Vashti, and Esther is brought to the palace in chapter 2. It comes her turn to appear before the king. He is greatly pleased with her and makes her the queen. In describing the king's pleasure with Esther, the writer comments, this is in 2:17, and the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Along with the account then of Esther's coronation is the narrating of Mordecai's saving the king's life from assassination. In the meantime, Hanan is promoted to the high position of Grand Vizier, and all lesser officials are required to do obedience obeisance to him. When Mordecai refuses to bow to him, Haman plots to exterminate the Jews. The king then approves the plot and gives Haman his signet ring, stamping the order of the extermination with authority. Lamentation follows. Here we're going to see all the way through chapter 3, Haman and what he now is going to plot. Lamentation follows among the Jews as Mordecai mourns in sackcloth in chapter 4. Esther hears of the plight of her people, and Mordecai calls upon her for help. She consents to plead for her people and submits herself to God's providential care. On the third day, Esther puts forth her royal robes, or puts on, I should say, her royal robes, and stands before the king. He receives her, extending the golden scepter to her. She asks him to have a banquet, inviting Haman. The king responds favorably, and the banquet is set. Chapter 5 then concludes by describing Haman's indignation and anger at the plot against Mordecai. In chapter 6, the king has a book of records read to him, which records the good deeds of Mordecai in saving the king's life. Haman is therefore forced to honor Mordecai in his previous work. When he tells his wife, she then declares his coming doom in chapter 6. On the day of the banquet, Esther the queen reveals Haman's plot to the king. The king then rises from the feast in wrath and anger and goes to the palace garden. Upon returning, he finds Haman falling upon the couch to dishonor Esther, and in a burst of anger gives command for his execution. Haman is then executed in the gallows, which he actually had prepared for Mordecai. This is all in chapter 7. On the same day, Mordecai is set over the house of Haman, making him prime minister and second only to the king. A new edict is issued to replace the old one, and the Jews are permitted to get revenge on their enemies. This is followed then by the institution of the Feast of Purim, which becomes a perpetual memorial of the deliverance of the Jews at that time. Finally, the book closes with a brief summary of Mordecai's advancement as prime minister in chapter 10, as he is pictured as being high in authority and as having the interest of the people at his heart. The writer then concludes the book with the following remark about Mordecai. For Mordecai, the Jew, was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the welfare of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. So when we look at the overview of the book, we could say in chapter 1 through chapter 4, we see the grave danger of the Jews and Haman's plot. Then in chapters 5 through 10, we see the great deliverance of the Jewish people. It is interesting, this becomes the basis of the Feast of Purim. And I would like to say again that while God's name is not mentioned in the book, many have said we see the finger of God, even though we don't see the name of God behind it all and his sovereignty working through Esther and through Mordecai.